Hey, what's up guys? In this video, we'll be learning exposure blending in Photoshop right after this. Hey, what's up guys, and welcome in. On this channel, we talk landscape photography, taking you out into the field, showing you tutorials, and actually reviewing some gear. So if you're new here, consider subscribing below. But I decided to do exposure blending for this video because I got an email from one of our subscribers. We'll call him Evan because that's his name. And he said, hey, I've looked for numerous articles and videos on exposure blending in Photoshop and they're really confusing. Could you consider making a video on how to use exposure blending in Photoshop, making it simple and easy to understand for photographers? So I decided to go ahead and do this and make this video because I think there's a lot of need for learning exposure blending and how to do it like really quickly and easily in Photoshop. So let's go over to the screen and see exactly how we can do that. All right, so on my screen, I have several images pulled up, but I have a couple that are rated as 2 stars, and one was taken at a longer exposure than the other one, and one was taken at a shorter exposure than the other one. So if we toggle over these, here's the lighter exposure, and that was shot at 1/13 of a second f/16 ISO 100. And the shorter exposure was shot at 1/20th of a second, f/16 ISO 100. And here's the combined image that we made out of these 2 photographs in Photoshop, just as the finished product. But we'll go through exactly how to do that right now. So basically, when you're out in the field, you shoot 2 different exposured photographs. You can shoot more than that, but for these type of photographs, like these sunset photographs where you want that glow or you want the sky to be a little bit darker and you're not using a graduated neutral density filter like some photographers prefer not to do, me being one of them, you can actually blend these together in Photoshop pretty simply. So what you're gonna do is select the longer exposure one and then hold down the Control key and select the shorter exposure one. You can also bring these over in Photoshop if you're not using Lightroom. But if you want to get into the Adobe Creative Cloud Photographers deal, I have that link below in the video description. It's only like 10 bucks a month, really easy to use, and you get all these programs to edit in. So I'm just gonna right click on these 2 selected photographs and I'm gonna go to Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now you don't go to Open in Photoshop, you go to Open as Layers. So you can actually load these already in Photoshop as layers, so it takes out like one step in the process. Makes it a little bit easier to bring these over and edit them the way we're going to create this multiple exposure blend in Photoshop. All right, so it's loaded these 2 layers in and we have the longer exposure on top, the shorter exposure on bottom. And what we can do just to be sure, we can toggle these eyeball icons on and off just to be sure everything's lining up. If you're not sure everything is lining up, you can select both of these layers and go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And this is just to be sure that all of your edges are lining up exactly. So when you blend these exposures together, you're not getting anything weird happening on any edges where like you have a double edge somewhere. So that basically works really fast. And next we're going to get into masks. Now to blend these exposures, we need to understand masks. It's basically like laying a mask on top of a layer to eliminate part of that photograph that's on top of another one and painting out specific parts or painting back in specific parts. So all you have to do is select the top layer and come down here to this create a mask icon that's right down here on the bottom of the right panel. You just click that and it'll show up as basically like a white piece of paper on top of the layer that you created this for. Make sure your layer mask is selected. You can tell it's selected because it has the outline around it. If I was selected on the photograph itself, it would be an outline around the photograph, but we have the layer mask selected right here. Next, we're going to use a gradient filter, and the gradient filter is located over here. It's like a rectangle with the gradient across the side of it, and you just click that, as a default, it'll come up with this gradient right here, which is good. And we want to be sure that this is selected because on top, it's going to be black and it's going to fade out to translucent on the bottom, which is exactly what we want. Now, why is that? With layer masks, a black color will reveal what's underneath the layer that we have selected. So the layer that's selected is the brighter exposure, but it's going to reveal the darker exposure down here. So we need to think about, what are we trying to reveal in the photograph underneath? Well, that's the darker sky, because we basically expose this photograph to the foreground for the sunset to get a good foreground exposure in, and then we expose the other one for the sky to get a good sky exposure. So since we have black on top, what we're going to do is simply click and drag this gradient tool into this photograph. And you can see it start to darken the sky in this. And you can do this several times. And you can also change up the opacity if you want this like 50% brought in, you can do that too. And you can basically just play around with this and start darkening different parts of the photograph just over and over. And I like to do it a little bit more just to see what it's going to bring in, like get some of these edges in. If you just keep clicking and dragging, it'll bring in more parts of that darker edge to make that transition a little bit smoother, so you don't have this hard edge of just good foreground and then line and then good sky. You can kind of blend this in a little bit more. Another good thing about masks is you can tell exactly where you've painted in if you come over and look back at the mask icon on the right panel in your layers panel. You can see exactly what you're revealing that's black in this layer mask as well, and what's still there in white from the layer that you're actually working on. So maybe you've made something a little bit too dark. Like I think on the left side of this photograph, it's a little bit too dark. What I can do is paint some of this layer back in on this layer mask. So actually what I can do is go to the adjustment brush tool, and I can have white selected. So all I'm gonna do is switch between my foreground and background colors to white, and white's going to paint this top layer back in. And I can change up the opacity, which is what I like to do because I don't want it to be like, bam, we like brought this back in, and you can really tell. I like to lower it down to like 20%, make a really subtle change, and use a really big brush. And you can increase that brush size using your bracket keys, your left and right brackets for larger and smaller. Basically what I'm gonna do is just start painting this back in. And I'm just gonna brush. And you can see on the layer mask icon, this is like gray now instead of black. So I brought in a little bit more. I might bring in a little bit more on these mountains just to reveal some detail in the rocks right there. And then also on this side, I got a little bit too dark on this very edge, makes it a little bit unnatural. So I'm just gonna paint that out as well. And there we go. I think that looks pretty good. We have the darker sky for sunset and that brighter effect that was there. And then we have the shadow detail in there as well. And all you have to do is click File, Save. And this is going to save this photograph into Lightroom. So we have this selected that we just edited. And of course I have some dust spots on this photograph that I can edit out. But overall, we've now blended two different exposures into one using Photoshop, using the gradient tool, using the brush tool, and using masks. So this is a fast, easy way of how you can achieve multiple exposures, blending these together in Photoshop, bringing in two different photographs and essentially combining them into one to getting a proper exposure to have foreground detail and sky detail as well. Really fast and simple way to do this. All right guys, if you like this video, you found it useful, go ahead and smash the like button or consider subscribing below, because we do these videos all the time on how you can be a better photographer.